Good. Hi, good morning. I suppose that we will start with me. Okay. I think I'm the first one. Good morning, Marta.
Hello, can you hear me?
Very bad.
Okay, perfect. We're just having a 5 minutes break and after we'll start.
Excuse me, can we speak in Portuguese or in Spanish?
Sí. En español.
En español, muy bien.
Tenemos una pausa de 5 minutos.
Ok.
Pues empezamos ya con el panel.
Sí, muy bien, muy bien. Tengo un PowerPoint para presentar. Entonces, podemos intentar de hacer una prueba.
Sí, de compartir pantalla.
Ok. Allora, share screen, ¿no? Share screen. Ok. Share. Can you see?
Sí.
Okay. Very good. Perfect. Está todo listo.
Perfecto. Pues deja de compartir pantalla.
Sí.
Y ya está.
Voy a retirar el PowerPoint. Pause share. Where I stop share.
Perfecto.
¿Mucho trabajo hoy, Marta?
Sí, hoy un poco de everything, pero bien.
Me imagino.
Sí.
¿Usted trabaja con Francisco Betancourt?
No, yo con Vinicius.
Ah, sí.
Es que o sea, él me dio clase, entonces por eso me he quedado con él.
Prendo. ¿Me escuchan muy bien? ¿Cómo está el micrófono?
Sí, se escucha todo perfecto.
Perfecto, muy bien. Marta, ¿usted sabe
cuánto tiempo cada uno de los conferencistas hablan en esta tarde? ¿Cuánto para cada uno? ¿Cuánto tiempo?
No, no. 5. 20. 20.
20 minutos. Gracias. Perfecto.
La cámara está ahí. The camera is there.
Hola, Francisco. ¿Cómo está? ¿Está tudo dando certo?
You need to put the microphone.
Ok.
Eh,
Tudo correu bem por aí?
Tudo mais ou menos, porque anteontem tivemos aqui em Belém uma tempestade muito forte, e a minha internet está muito instável por causa disso. A luz apagou em toda a cidade e até agora a universidade não tem eletricidade. Então, tive que vir para minha casa, mas aqui também não está muito estável. Estou só fazendo o possível para que tudo dê certo até o final, pelo menos, da minha apresentação, mas eu já peço desculpas pela instabilidade. De fato, a tempestade aqui foi uma coisa terrível, muito forte. Estamos, de fato, em pleno de aquecimento global, claro.
Olha, Décio, queres falar no princípio?
Pode ser, tanto faz. Para mim está bem.
Deixa ser o Zé Vicente no princípio, falas tu. Assim que
Sim.
recomeçarmos, falas tu, porque estás aí com isso estável agora. Preferes falar agora?
Agora está bem, sim, agora está bem. Mas eu não garanto que esteja até assim, até o final.
Talvez seja melhor falares quando começarmos agora, está bem?
Sim, ok.
Começamos dentro de 5 minutos, está bem?
Tudo bem.
Ok.
Obrigado, Francisco.
Aí eu vou buscar. Temos como?
Yes.
Fica aqui. Assim.
Ou eu passo para aqui, ou tu passas para aqui. Passo para aqui, para não ficarmos também um em cada ponta.
Não faz muito sentido. Depois tem que deixar para sentar aqui para não ter muitos. Está bem, está bem.
So, we start for this last section of indigenous and environmental rights. We have here with us Professor José Vicente Serrão from the University Institute of Lisbon. I think that's the latest name. And he published extensively on the history of the Portuguese agriculture, and edited a book which is extremely useful. I go back to that book regularly on land property and colonial environment. And he is director of, well, nowadays, and for some time, the best journal of history in Portugal, Ler História. And so it is a pleasure to have him here. And Professor Décio Guzmão from the Universidade Federal do Pará, whom I met long time ago in Paris, and he has a big book on the dans le labyrinthe du Kumai, Échange, Guerre et Mission, and he published extensively on the indigenous communities in the Amazon, on Jesuit missions, on transgressions, invasions, and so he is one of the researchers more knowledgeable about the history of the Amazon. So they had, he just told me, they had a big storm in Belém yesterday. So it's very unstable, the system. He had to go back home because at the university he didn't have broadband. And it's still a bit unstable. So what we decided was to start with Décio and then with José Vicente Serrão. Okay? Décio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francisco. First of all, I would like to thank Professor and dear friend Francisco Betancourt for inviting me to speak of the symposium. I apologize for reading my presentation. I also apologize for the instability of my connection The day before yesterday, we had a big storm in my city, which cut the electricity supply to my entire university and part of the urban area. These are the clear effects of the global warming times in which we live less, which demonstrate to me the importance of this symposium. I was invited to speak about Amazonian indigenous communities and the environmental impacts caused by the Portuguese Empire in the Amazon context. On this subject, we can list a series of elements that invite us to reflect and offer some answers. The first is the notion of domestication. According to current demographic estimates by archaeologists, there may have been 5 or 6 million people in Amazonia at the time of European contact. Charles Clement states that these people cultivated or managed at least 138 plant species at the time of Columbus' arrival on the new continent. Certainly, with the average estimate of the population with these numbers, it is no longer possible to believe in environmental restrictions affecting the population growth in this area of South America. In contrast to early claims of universal environmental restrictions, the current consensus among historical ecologists contends that Amazonia is a complex mosaic of interconnected human natural systems, typical of anthropogenic biomes or anthromes globally. Today, we know that Amazonia plants and animal species was domesticated before the arrival of Europeans in a dimension that we did not imagine before. The very notion of landscape and nature for Amazonian natives in this debate must be defined. For the indigenous peoples of the region, the forest, savannas, hills, and streams are their homes, gardens, backyards, living reserves, and sacred places. Through indigenous coexistence with diverse non-human species, the Amazon Valley have become one of the world's main centers of plant and non-human domestication. But what did it mean to plant among native societies in the Amazon before contact with Europeans? In European old regime, between the 16th and 18th centuries, where logical thinking prevails and non-contradictory principles guide the attribution of meaning to the world and things of the world, the differences between things and human and non-human individuals are, in general, external and comprehensive. They serve to distinguish and group these individuals into a set of fixed nuclei or identities, that is, into classes, genera, or species. In short, during this period, to seek meaning is to bring to light what is similar. In short, in original words de Michel Foucault, chercher le sens, c'est mettre au jour ce que se ressemble for the Europeans. The Amazon before the Portuguese Empire subverts this idea doubly. If, according to archaeologists and anthropologists, a large part of the Amazon forest of an anthropic nature was, so to speak, planted over the centuries by men, not forgetting the action of seed dispersing animals, birds, apples, rodents, bats, etc. From the perspective of Amazonian natives of different ethnicities, the forest is a huge non-human plantation, This is the case of the Yoji from Venezuela, from whom many so-called wild plants are considered to be the cultivated crop of spiritual or mythical figures, which in turn are viewed as the farmers of the forest. The Ashuar people of the Equatorian Amazon believe that the forest is cultivated by Chacain people of the guardian spirit of plants, master of vegetable destinies, and great gardener of the forest. From the Yanomami point of view, the trees in the forest and the cultivated plants do not grow by themselves, but thanks to the work of Niroperi, the spirit of fertility, who causes the growth of vegetation wherever he goes and has a human appearance, but is visible only to the shamans. But domestication cannot be used as the only parameter for plant manipulation and human development in the Amazon Valley in early modern periods. In some cases, it was preferable to improve plants in the setting of a domesticated landscape, rather than bringing them into full domestication dependent on human care. The importance of these non-domesticated or semi-domesticated species has been underestimated and often overlooked by environmental historians. An example of this is the role of women in handling plants. Indigenous women traditionally participate in the selection of plant species. Among the Tupinambás of the 16th century, planting was the task of adult women, while men were responsible for slash and burn, that is, preparing the land by felling trees and burning them. The women cultivators associated with the planting of cultivars among the ancient Tupi is proven for several plants, also among other Amazonian linguistic groups for centuries. For example, the cassava, Maniote esculenta, among the Tucano of the Walpes River, and the sweet potato, Ipomoea batatas, among the Kayapó of the Xingu River, or the Guaraná, Paulinia sorbilis, among the Sateremaué of the Miro Amazon River. A notable fact is that all these cultivars reproduce asexually, demonstrating a selection of plants in agricultural practices that guarantee the preservation of the genetic variety in the constitution of the germoplasm banks over centuries. Since Portuguese colonization, Amazonia has been seen as a source of raw materials and natural products. The proliferation of searches for plants resources in tropical ecosystems, especially for the pharmaceutical and agricultural products, has made natural history a buzzword. Here again, indigenous women play an important role in the bioprospecting. For example, contraceptive plants fall into this category of feminine knowledge. Among the Deni, the Arawak of Purus River, the Dioecious liana, Uraria tecunarum, is widely used as a beku, that is Arawak word for contraceptive plant. Just as the Caritiana of Rondônia also use Uraria Tecunarum for the same purpose. The search for mineral resources during the 17th and 18th centuries in the Amazon also involved prospecting and capturing native knowledge for colonial purposes. There are several moments that show this practice, but the missions of Franciscan and Jesuit priests are the first of them. Of great importance of this prospection was the inventory carried out by the Franciscan friar Cristóvão de Lisboa. It is a manuscript of notes on the animals and trees of Maranhão, written between the years 1624 and 627. The manuscript would be part of a more ambitious project of a natural and moral history of Maranhão. It comprises 259 drawings of fish, plants, birds, and various animals, followed by the corresponding description. Friar Cristóvão went to Brazil in 1624 with the task of founding a Franciscan custody in Maranhão and Pará, areas with a strong French and Dutch presence, whose settlement Portugal sought to encourage and where relations with the native populations were decisive. Theologian without scientific training or talent for drawing, Friar Cristóvão used local informants, indigenous and mestizo, to collect information for his natural history. Although the manuscript of the natural history on the animal plants of Maranhão was never published, it certainly circulated in Maranhão in Portugal, thus contributing to establish the political and colonial influence of the Catholic monarchy in the Amazon Valley. In the manuscript, the species of Amazonian flora and fauna are identified by the name with which they were designated locally, accompanied with the most part by a short description of the use that the locals made in the sketch. This is now, we see the baiacu fish, the piranha fish, the jambu herb, or the maracajá cat in manuscript display. The Jesuits are also played an important role in apprehending indigenous knowledge to strengthen Portuguese imperial power. The logistical basis of the Jesuit work was based on the urbanization process carried out by these religions in the Amazon Valley from the 17th century onwards. This first Jesuit urbanization contributed with great effectiveness to the impacts of the Portuguese Empire action on indigenous ecological knowledge. Jesuit urbanization consisted of systematically implanting catechetical villages among indigenous populations. From the middle 16th onwards, urbanization triggered by Catholic missionaries resulted in the multiplication of indigenous villages. There were more than 60 Jesuit villages in Indian evangelization in the mid-18th century. This is, in my view, one of the fundamental elements, as it consists of bringing together various indigenous societies within a framework imposed and designed by Catholic Europeans. The imposition of a language, Tupi, produced by the missionaries, represents another decisive factor in the transformation of indigenous societies into the raw material of Portuguese imperial policy. An example of this capture mechanism worked through the Triagas, produced in the College of the Society of Jesus throughout Portuguese America, which were structured in networks. The pharmaceutical and chemical work of Father André da Costa was famous in his time. He was born in Lyon, France, around 1648. He joined the Company of Jesus in Bahia, in Brazil, aged 28 on February 1676. He was regarded by his superiors as a noted pharmacist and chemist. Optimus pharmacopula, chemicus insignis are the expressions used by your superiors about him. He always worked in Bahia. He was a man of impulsive genius, but very capable in the preparation of medicines within the pharmacopoeia of the time. The New Latin, and before entering, he had been a surgeon. In the Coleção de Várias Receitas, which describes the Triaga Brasílica celebérrima em todo aquele novo mundo de botica do Colégio da Bahia, it reads, this is the teriyaki that was originally made by Brother André da Costa. He gathered medicinal plants of farmhouses, quintas, or farms in minerals, which seemed useful, and sent them to be picked up, sometimes from far away, like this one from Maranhão, and referred by Bettendorf, a Jesuit. Bettendorf, in words of Bettendorf, a white stone must not be ignored, which flakes like talc and looks like glass, whose mine was found in the big tank towards the bush, about 6 or 7 spans away from the ditch, and from her corner, about 20, more or less. Brother André, apothecary of Bahia, heard about his mineral and ordered some for his remedies. Attempts to reform and finance the Portuguese crown to promote silviculture based on the timber market tended to undermine indigenous institutions, in particular what anthropologists call the gift economy, allowing only the term silviculture to refer to planted trees. These measures ignored indigenous forest use and conservation strategies, which are embedded in more complicated integrated resource management systems that value forest for more than their wood and wood products. From the middle of 17th onwards, the Companhia do Comércio do Grão-Pará e Maranhão carried out economic reforms of a mercantilist nature in the Amazonian Valley, intervening directly in the region forestry policy. The two most important economic activities intensified in this sense during the period were the collection of backwoods drugs, widely practiced in previous centuries, and the cutting of timber. The Amazonian wood exported by the arsenals of Belém and São Luís was significant, either in the form of schools to be used in the Lisbon shipyards or in the form of ready-made boats built in the Pará shipyards. There was a continuous growth in this export from the middle of 17th. It is important to say that in the second half of 18th century, the terms scarcity, escassez, and conservation, conservação, became generalized in the Portuguese vocabulary related on the Amazon. Since the beginning of colonization and domination, indigenous and traditional peoples have been treated as backward and primitive, and as such are seen as barriers of progress and enlightenment. These two concepts were promoted by the Marquês de Pombal in the second half of the 18th century and his half-brother, who governed Grão-Pará and Maranhão between 1751 and 1759. This attitude fueled and justified policies that dispossessed the Amazonian natives of their lands, territories, and resources. Historians also continue to believe that traditional indigenous knowledge is more folklore. It is enough to verify the place is still at the margin, occupied by environmental history and historical ecology in Brazilian academy, below the domains of the great history, political, economic, social, and others. The Portuguese also engaged in extensive hunting or fishing activities, which led to the depletion of wildlife populations and disrupted the ecological balance of the region. An example of this is the case of river turtles. Product name is Expansa, your scientific name. The largest freshwater turtle of the world was long been a significant source of food for mestizos and Indians living in the Amazon and Orinoco basins. Although this turtle and its marine relatives were once widely spread throughout tropical South America, overfishing for both fresh and eggs has made them both vulnerable species. Recognizing the nutritional significance of these 150-pound reptiles, the indigenous people of Amazonia confined them for year-round cultivation. In 1542, the discovery of a community with more than 1,000 turtles in flooded enclosures and wells down the Amazon was relieving for Spaniard Orellana, discoverer and his hungry men. Gustavo de Acunha claimed that there were few villages along the same river a century later that had less than 100 correlated turtles, and that the locals were therefore spared from starvation. Such cultural barriers and a nascent market economy made it possible for turtles and aborigines to cohabit in a thriving way. The broken eggs were exposed to the sun for several days in order to create a thicker oil that would be combined with resin for caulking. Numerous turtles were murdered for his purpose, with the meat being set aside for vultures and caimans, and the finest oil was made by boiling flesh fat. Indians quickly mastered the art of battering turtle products for metal commodities, particularly for nails that they fashioned into a round and harpoon heads for use in hunting, fishing, and turtle harvesting. At first, missionaries and government officials alike enforced strict conservation laws on the oil sector. To give this important resource a chance to reproduce at least a third of a nestling beach was left unharmed. The Jesuits did not permit the entire beach to be searched, they left a part untouched, said Humboldt of the Orinoco, for fear of seeing the breed of Aral tortoise, if not destroyed, at least considerably diminished. Families of Amazonia who wished to take part in the egg harvest on the 15 royal beaches received special permissions. The Itapewa and Corasteua cities, villages, beaches alone produced 2,000 pots of oil per year in the 18th century, demonstrating how perfectly these beaches produced. The Portuguese enslaved indigenous people and forced them to work in harsh conditions on plantations and mines. This exploitation of human labor also had a significant impact on the environment, as the slaves were often forced to work long hours in hazardous conditions without proper protection. Overall, the environmental impact of the Portuguese Empire on native groups in Brazil and Amazonia between the 16th and 18th centuries was significant and long-lasting. It led to the destruction of ecosystems, depletion of wildlife populations, and forced labor, which has devastating effects on the indigenous people who depended on the land for their livelihoods. In general, the environmental impact of Portuguese Empire on native groups in Amazonia between the 17th and 18th centuries was significant and long-lasting. The Amazon has been a place where indigenous peoples have lived, fished, and hunted since time immemorial. Any disruption of this physical and spiritual interconnections leaves Amazonian natives malnourished and ill. As the environment is plundered, contaminated, and destroyed, so is the loss of our knowledge of plants, herbs, trees, and conservation techniques. When the plants are gone, our knowledge is gone. When our knowledge is gone, our soul is gone. When our soul is gone, then we as a people will cease to exist. Needless to add that failure to understand this indigenous equation is having a strong impact upon the rest of our planet. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Décio. We will return to you, and the questions will now, José Vicente Serrão will talk, and then at the end, we'll have questions for you and him. So, it's your floor.
Okay. Francisco invited me to come here to talk about the environmental impact of colonialism from the perspective of indigenous rights. Mostly or primarily on land and territorial indigenous rights. Thanks for the invitation, Francisco, but it's a hell of a challenge because we have here a kind of I'd say an equation with three elements: colonialism, environment, and indigenous rights. That is quite difficult to relate or to equate or to interrelate. So, but let's try to say something about this. That colonialism impacted the environment, and that the environment conditioned colonialism is easy to accept, although the latter is often a bit overlooked. That colonialism had an impact on indigenous rights, and that this condition colonialism, I would say, idem evident. The relation between environment and indigenous peoples can also be established in both ways. I mean, they were adapted to the indigenous, they were adapted to the environment and impacted it as any human activity does, even in the absence of colonial rulers or before their arrival. So the hardest thing here about this equation is crossing the three elements. As I put it in the title of my presentation, how did all this intersect? For example, to what extent were indigenous peoples affected not by colonialism, generally speaking, but by its environmental impacts? Or to what extent did the impact of colonialism on indigenous rights have environmental consequences? I'm not sure I can answer this or answer properly, but maybe at the end of this conversation, with your contribution, we can we can shed some light on the issue. Well, to start with, I would say that what happened to native rights, and specifically to their land and the territorial rights, needs to be placed in a wider context, because it depended on a variety of factors, mainly the pre-colonial indigenous, the existing land rights, whether they exist or not, or how strong they were. And second, depended on the balance between colonizers and colonized, in several aspects, but above all in demographic terms. What was the balance? It depends on the relevance of land to the colonial project, which was obviously different whether it was primarily focused on settlement or resource exploitation or plantations or trade. It depended also on the kind of society and social relations that developed in the colonies over time. We have to think not only of on the first moments of colonization, but how did it evolve all along the colonial period. We have also to take into considerations the indigenous capability to resist and to negotiate. Also, of course, the cultural background of the colonizing power, and since we are here considering the topic of this symposium, we have to put in the equation the environmental conditions and their suitability for Europeans. So it was the different combination of all these variables in each place that determined how native rights were treated, thus explaining the variety of solutions and outcomes found over time and space. But this is the global picture and the main points to keep in mind. Let me brief you now about what happened in the early modern Portuguese Empire, and let me emphasize that I'm speaking only about the early modern period, which presents, I think, totally different issues when compared with the 19th and 20th century. The Portuguese began their imperial venture in the early 15th century by colonizing the virgin and unpopulated North Atlantic islands of Madeira and Azores, recruiting people from the mainland and offering them land grants called sesmarias. It was possible to create lasting agricultural colonies there of the plantation type, sugarcane, in the case of Madeira, with, by the way, and as we have already talked about here, with a strong environmental impact. As they moved south to the also Virgin Islands of Cape Verde and São Tomé in the tropical zone, they faced new challenges. And the case of Cape Verde is worth mentioning. First, because it is a clear example of how colonialism was also impacted by quite adverse environmental factors, which particularly compromised agricultural activities and caused high morbidity and mortality rates among European settlers. And second, because for the first time there was a massive incorporation of African people, mostly enslaved, in a Portuguese colony. And third, because in the absence of a true native population at the outset, it was as if it had been recreated through an extensive and continuous miscegenation between people of European and African descent. And it was this Creole population that adapted and knew how to take advantage of the environmental conditions of these islands. And then Brazil, whose colonization only began in the 1530s with the creation of donatory captaincies and the arrival of the first contingents of settlers from Portugal. Despite some similarities with the previous experience in the Atlantic Islands, the colonization of Portuguese America would bring some differences, the most important being, for the purposes of our discussion here today, the vastness of the territory, the plenty of resources, land included, its climatic suitability for the settlement of European people, and above all, that it was not terra nullius. In fact, the territory was already occupied by several indigenous nations, which for the first time after more than a century of colonization introduced the issue of native rights. And this novelty was perceived by the colonizer as both an opportunity and a threat. Opportunity because it meant the availability of labor force, threat because it could delay the occupation of the territory. On the side of the colonized, there were probably, I suppose, similar mixed feelings. Never giving up on claiming their territorial rights, the indigenous nations, which were not a homogeneous mass, but hundreds of different groups, reacted to colonization in different ways. Some accepted and accommodated the colonial order. Others avoided contact with Europeans and moved or were driven away to new areas, and still others actively resisted and thus effectively constrained the process. However, the low demographic density of the indigenous populations, plus the fact that they did not have an agriculturalist profile with a permanent occupation of the land, facilitated the continuous takeover of their territories whenever it was necessary to advance the frontier of colonization. In turn, the fact that indigenous peoples in Brazil were very heterogeneous and not organized into a solid, unified political structure allowed the Portuguese to simply divide them up as allies or enemies. The former were drawn into the colonizer's sphere and the latter were fought and some of them enslaved. Add to all of these the effect of diseases brought by the Europeans, which should have decimated up to 90% of the indigenous populations, thus representing the true and greatest impact they got from colonialism. What's more, this high mortality means that the native population, estimated at 2.5 million at the beginning of colonization, had already been surpassed in the mid-17th century by the population of European and African origin. At the turn of the 19th century, Indians were no more than 250,000, only 8% of the total population, against 1 million whites and 2 million Africans. Meanwhile, I'd like to mention the policy of resettlement called Portuguese aldeamentos, which stands out in what concerns the allied or pacified Indians. It consisted of concentrating indigenous groups in villages, often created ex nihilo, aiming at their surveillance, evangelization, and use as labor and military force against other Indians. This policy was ordered by the Crown and began in 1548 with the creation of the first villages near the capital city of Salvador, and later extended to the indigenous groups closer to the other areas of colonization. Later, in the 17th century, a new policy emerged, the one of descimentos, which consisted of bringing down from the backlands the indigenous groups still resistant and resettling them in the areas under the control of the colonial authorities. Another important policy was the allocation of lands to the Indians, which began as early as 1562, when the Queen ordered that the Sesmaria should be granted to an indigenous village in Espírito Santo. This granting of formal land rights to indigenous villages, called Sesmarias de Índios, as well as their protection against the intrusion of white settlers, was reiterated by successive legislation throughout the entire colonial period, for instance, in 1596, in 1609, in 1700, in 1757, and so on. In addition to these, so to speak, collective land grants, Indians were also encouraged or allowed to farm pieces of land on an individual basis as tenants, quit renters, or squatters. In short, the impact of colonialism on native peoples in Portuguese America was therefore twofold. The dark side is that they ended up largely dispossessed of their ancestral lands and territories, were fought in the so-called just wars, were enslaved or forced to work, were subjected to forced migrations, their way of life was changed, and worst of all, they were lethal victims of diseases introduced by the Europeans. But on the other hand, there was also from the very beginning a concern to protect them, to assimilate them into the colonial order, and to provide them with means of subsistence, including land. This was the result of political, economic, and moral concerns, even if paternalistic or self-serving, especially on the part of the authorities and missionaries. Colonists tended to act otherwise. Unconcerned with politics and driven by self-interest, they saw the natives and their lands simply as a valuable assets to be taken and used whenever needed and possible. And this was, of course, the cause of endless conflicts. In all this, however, I cannot see any relevant link with environmental issues. Let's move now to the Indian Ocean, to the eastern side of the Portuguese Empire, where we find a quite different situation. And this applies with some difference, but applies to the three cases that I choose to bring here, because they were the cases where the Portuguese developed projects of territorial occupation. Goa, the so-called northern province, and Ceylon, or Sri Lanka. I'll be very brief. I'm not sure what I am in terms of time, but I suppose okay, that's good. Well, but I'll be brief. First, the Portuguese in Asia were few in number. They exercised a more precarious sovereignty, and for the most part, they were not interested in farming. Land basically mattered as a source of tax income, and the private rents also, or as a tool of colonial governance, for instance, to reward soldiers, to reward officials, the native elites, and so on. Second, the Portuguese had to deal there with densely occupied territories, well-organized native societies with a strong cultural and religious identity and well-defined land rights. In such a context, the Portuguese authorities realized that they should keep, rather than change, the global status quo, respecting as much as possible the existing indigenous rights, especially in what concerned the situation of the ordinary people, and intervening only at the top and middle levels, those that secured political and fiscal control and the access to rents. So changes in the legal and institutional framework regulating land and territorial rights were minimal and more nominal than real. The granting of lands to Portuguese individuals, settlers, and others was also minimal. Dispossession of indigenous land, at least in a systematic way, was absent. However, despite this quite conservative policy, and perhaps unexpectedly, Portuguese colonial rule would end up having a strong impact on native societies due to the religious issue. The attempt to impose a new religion meant widespread spiritual violence against native peoples, to start with, which often resulted in revolts and massive escapes. More importantly, conversion to Christianity, while not compulsory, was a condition for those among the indigenous elites who wanted to collaborate with the new rulers and thus benefit from the redistribution of lands and rents. And this would generate significant dynamics that change in the distribution of land, wealth, and social power within native societies. And this takes me to a small little reflection. I think it would be important to look at native peoples not as a homogeneous and undifferentiated mass, nor just as victims and passive subjects of colonialism. The natives' agency should not be overlooked. I think this is methodologically, this is an important point in this kind of studies. Colonial rule shook existing balances in societies that were already heterogeneous from different points of view. The various groups and individuals that made up these societies reacted differently according to circumstances of time and place. While some resisted, others accommodated to the new situation, and with agency seized the opportunity to resolve old internal conflicts or to improve their social, economic, or political situation. And for this, they often used the instruments made available by the colonizer, for instance, religious conversion, laws, courts, land distribution, holding positions in the colonial administration, and so on. It's true that at the end of the day, some ended up as losers, but others also as winners in this process that was fostered or generated by colonialism. And some concluding remarks now. Here's what I can conclude from the Portuguese colonial experience in the early modern period, and let me emphasize again that this is my time frame, early modern, perhaps much different from the others. So first, Portuguese colonization in the Atlantic, not in Asia, did have environmental impacts. They are easy to identify, but so far they have not been exactly quantified. That is something that I think we need. Although the quantification sometimes with the lack of sources take us to a dimension that is, I don't know. I'm thinking about an exercise of quantification of the loss of lands in the United States, the loss of indigenous lands in the United States made recently in 2019 or 21, I don't know, by a scholar, the name Farrell and his co-authors, who tried to calculate, to estimate the whole percentage of lands lost by the indigenous peoples, and then to estimate the impact that these have or has today in the lives of the indigenous peoples. But I think this is very interesting experiments, I'd say, the experiments, but the results are, well, are subject to discussion, I suppose. So first, Portuguese colonization did have environmental impacts. Second, but we know some about those impacts, but we have not yet quantified them. Second, the reverse is even more true. In other words, Portuguese colonization, like others, was conditioned by environmental factors. This explains, for example, why territories like Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea had an irrelevant presence of white settlers before the late 19th century, and others such as Cape Verde or São Tomé were left behind by the Europeans, replaced by a mixed-race population that had meanwhile acquired resistance to the hostile climatic factors. Third, Portuguese colonization had an impact on native land rights. However, with a great deal of variation, as I have, as we could see, at least in my presentation. And finally, as for possible significant connections between environmental issues and native rights, I can see them. I can see them. Sorry to disappoint you. Of course, we could say that if colonization had some environmental impacts, and if colonization was only possible where indigenous resistance was overcome, then fewer assaults on indigenous rights would have delayed colonization, and in turn, this delay would have delayed or mitigated environmental impacts. But as you can see, this is in fact an overly generalist and simplistic reasoning. But maybe you can give me some help or some tips on how to go further, and what to do to get more important conclusions about this. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I was tempted to start asking questions, but I'm going to resist my temptation. And so first, oh, thank you, Martin.
Thank you both, Décio and Zé Vicente, for your illuminating presentations. And yeah, you know, taking the cue of what Zé Vicente just said about the connections between these issues there, you know, environmental issues, native rights, native land, especially native land rights. I think this comment will, in a way, connect Zé Vicente and Décio's presentation. Because Zé Vicente was comparing what happened in Brazil and in India, right? And he said something like, yeah, in Brazil, indigenous societies did not have very well settled, organized land rights, in contrast to indigenous societies in India. I think, I'm not sure I agree. I think native Brazilians did have what could be argued, what could be seen as land rights, but the key here is they were not in writing. They were not in writing. Okay, they did not express themselves in any form of scriptural alphabetic writing. Okay, their land rights were inscribed in the landscape itself, which in a way connects to what Décio was telling us about the way indigenous peoples transformed the landscape. For example, by planting fruit trees, right? The practice of planting fruit trees transformed in the long run, not only the Amazon, but also in a lesser extent, I would say, the Atlantic forest, the biogeography of the forest, right? So, for example, some land rights could be readily recognized by indigenous societies through the presence of certain fruit trees, right? Because it was a form of territorialization, right? They planted certain species so they could, get fruit, in a later date, right? So this was a form, and of course, Sweden agriculture, which would transform the forest landscape, right? But this was this was all embedded in an oral ecology, so to speak, right? Rather than in writing. And I suppose I have very, very little, not to say any, knowledge on the Indian case, but I suppose all the land rights there were very firmly established in writing. And of course, there, you know, if you go down this path of examining the importance, the agent, so to speak, of writing, there is a link between the erasure, so to speak, of indigenous rights through Portuguese alphabetic writing. For example, the writing of Seis Maria charters, right? If you read the charters with this in mind, you can see that they erase the presence of indigenous transformations of the landscape. For example, through the concept of someone talked about this, right? This idea of the well, in the Brazil's case, it was the idea of the sertão, right? The sertão, this empty landscape, right? And of course, the erasure of indigenous presence, the appropriation of the land, led to this very important environmental transformation through agricultural appropriation and sugar plantations and other kinds of plantations, right? Yeah, that was my intervention. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to that as well, but I think there is a question here somewhere. So and my question is, I think for Zé Vicente mostly. So Europeans arrive somewhere and this somewhere is populated more often than not. And then there is the settlement of communities, village, cities, small communities, larger communities, over time, relatively large cities. There's the development of plantation complexes. There's the extraction of resources, mining. And all of these seems to take place in a vacuum. It's empty. That is the theory for Africa, right? That's all, you know, Hopkins and Thornton and whatnot. And then, you know, comes Mariana Candida and says, actually, no, for Angola, what you see is that people actually have the ownership of land, but if the ones arriving do not recognize that ownership, then there is a problem. So I think a very practical question for your analysis and for your last table is, so the Portuguese arrive in Brazil and there's nothing. There's no people there. There are people there. These people are mobile. Mobility is something that Amelia touched upon. But from the eyes of the ones arriving, there's no ownership because there's no fences, because there's no acts of property. So how can you conceptualize the development of a colonial society, particularly in Brazil, but also in Angola, as not land grabbing? So how can we conceptualize this differently than land grabbing? It is land grabbing if we assume that the people that were there had some type of property or conceptualization of occupation of the land, which is different than private property. Or we say, no, there was no land grabbing, but then we need to do one of two things. The land was nobody's and thus was taken by the Europeans, and or there were negotiations to take that land, which is the way Mariana actually gets to understand why the land was taken in the first place. Either way, two things happen. Communities are forced to move. If they're not already moving, they will be moving, pressed into the interior. Again, the mobility is where Amelia was talking about earlier today, creating all types of pressures in the environment, but also changing migration paths from, for instance, Amazonia to Peru. And secondly, and I think most importantly, the destruction of the idea of the commons. And I know that the whole discussion of the tragedy of the commons starts far later on. I think we actually can adopt a lot of the arguments about the tragedy of the commons, actually with the destruction of communal senses of uses of land that may not be of property as defined by Europeans, but still that infringes on customary practice. So I'm not sure whether I agree with you, or I would like you to explain us a little bit more of your thought process when you say that you do not see a direct link between indigenous people colonialism and the problem of environmental changes or environmental impact. Because as soon as you settle down, you build cities, you build towns, you start plantations, I'm not sure that that's not impact, particularly if those spaces are usable communally or personally by the ones that are there, regardless of how we conceptualize those rights and whether they're written or not, whether they're imaginary, whether they're ancestral. And it's just, it's not agree or disagree, it's just to try to understand your thought process.
José Augusto Padua. Okay, I will, in that case, I will add some questions because they're a little bit in line. Yes.
A field that has been growing a lot is what is indigenous history, in close dialogue with environmental history, anthropology, etc. And the level of the lake of aggregation, cultural aggregation, let's say, or political, in a certain sense, in a non-Western sense, was, I mean, the decentralization was bigger than we imagined. Most of the indigenous nations that became average knowledge in Brazilian history, the Tupiniquins, the Tupinambás, to start with the big division between Tupi and Guarani. If the people that are working with indigenous history say this is colonial building, colonial ethnogenesis. No? This division do not exist. So this makes more difficult for this kind of perception of the land, of the signals and the plants and the entities and everything that was part of these cultures to be accepted or even understood by Europeans. There were not even aggregated nations. Each unity was living a certain kind of relationship with the space, and different from the neighbor, and different from the other neighbor. Even if there were some similarities in relation to language, the roots, the root languages, the troncos language. So yeah, this is just to help to complement this this lake of understanding, of mutual understanding. But I think the violation of the land rights was so clear. Different means, but there were people living there. These people were forced to move or to become to live on a subaltern condition, but or they simply die, or they migrated a lot. So that's the point. But I want to bring another aspect.
So I just have also 2 or 3 questions. So the first to Décio. Would you say, Décio, are you listening there or are you still there?
Where? No, sure. I apologize, but
Wait. My connection is going to drop. So Marta, can you check whether he's still around or not?
half an hour ago.
Yeah, it was half an hour ago. So I think he's.
Yeah,
He's out. Okay. Well, it is a pity, but well, I will reconnect with him later. So concerning José Vicente, well, thank you for all the work, because it was I gave you a task which is difficult on you. So it was so because I was wondering, there was the original idea was that Mariana Cândido had published several books on property in Bengala, and I thought you could touch on that. I could have been more explicit about it to discuss the issue of collective property, because we think about property in a biased way. We think private, and property is collective also. And so you have communal property, you have collective property, and you have to integrate all these at that level with all these indigenous populations. So this is the first issue. The second one concerns, well, Katya already touched the no impact, environment impact. Well, if you withdraw the populations, and what I was asking Desi was, is it possible to say, it seems more or less obvious, but still it's a matter of quantification, that the impact, the colonial impact on most Brazil was, well, eradicating populations, forcing migrations, was much more serious than in the Amazon. So the environment of Amazon seems to be more welcoming to resistance. So that's one of the issues that was clearly there. I think that I wanted him to elaborate more on this. In any case, when you force all these migrations and when you replace populations, the management of the territory changes radically. Because when the indigenous are there, they have a certain management of the territory. And the thing is when the colonialists arrive and they manage territory in a completely different way. So this is the second issue. The third one is about Asia. Well, you are right that, as far as I know, you are right to say that there were no radical transformations. I mean, concerning the use of land and the practice of local work. But, for instance, thinking about the register of land, of property in Sri Lanka. The Portuguese launched that at the turn of the 16th to the 17th century, the Tombos de Ceilão, which are partly published, by the way. And the purpose of, and this is a colonial enterprise, which is crucial. The British did that in all territories to do the cadastre, to do the register of property. And this was quite early. And the register of property in Sri Lanka had the purpose of identifying holes, and it was very much oral tradition, identifying holes, put pressure on the population to declare how could they prove that the property had certain features, who were the lords and overlords, and to replace as much as possible the overlordship of certain properties. And we know that some properties were given in Sri Lanka to religious orders, were given to captains, were given to, so you have, it was not dramatic, it was not a complete shift, but there was a shift. And the same with the other areas of all that stretch, Terras do Norte in the case of South Asia. So you have also this push for changing the overlordship. So it's true that at local level you don't have a replacement, but you have a replacement concerning lordship up to a certain percentage. So there are changes. A little bit, not dramatic, but there are changes. Yeah. But is it possible to think a little bit more on Angola and property in Angola? Because I like very much the books by Maria de Cândido. There is a moment, I have to discuss this with her, in which she talks about private property, which was not so diffused in Portugal, and tries to equate a little bit with the colonial side. But there was such thing as private property in Portugal from a long period of time. And when I was doing my research on your question, I was bumping into private property, rural and urban, but mainly also rural. But what she says about Angola, I think it's very good and very, very important. Paul, you wanted to add something? Sorry, you have all this.
Let me add an aspect that I think will help. We need to consider also the indirect impacts. For example, of course, the introduction of microorganisms or diseases, but also the introduction of cattle, the introduction of grasses, the introduction of plants, because the Europeans do not control the biological history of each one of these introductions. The animals and the plants, they reproduce and they spread by themselves. So the amount of grasses in the Brazilian territory today that are exotic, introduced, is much bigger than the colonial authorities could imagine, because there is this indirect impact that is very big. And some evidences, for example, along the Amazonas River, there are many archaeological sites, pre-European archaeological, but there are few indigenous populations living near the Amazonas River now. So there was a depopulation in the Amazonas River, of course, very strong. And there are debates about the indirect impact of diseases that could have killed whole populations that did not see an European in their life. So what I'm saying is that the systemic impacts and the systemic consequences goes beyond the direct action. And also we need to remember that when we see the map, there is a certain feeling of a continuous occupation, but the occupation was very discontinuous, this idea of the sertões. I personally met an indigenous group in Rondônia, they are not so far away, that in 1970, they didn't have any idea about Brazil, about Rondônia. And they were living there in the state of Rondônia, in the country called Brazil, without knowledge. They didn't have any knowledge about it. So when Brazil arrived in their lives, it was a disaster. So this juxtaposition of different times, different moments that happens in history, we need to consider also in this question about impacts, environmental impacts, and rights, and all these things.
No, I think
just to help.
To say something now because it's too much. Sorry for this barrage of questions and remarks.
No, and I thank you very much for the questions you have raised and the comments that you offered. This is a difficult issue. However, let me, I don't know exactly where to start. Maybe to clarify some things that following some of the questions you raised, I'm convinced that I didn't express myself quite clearly. So, first of all, but I recall my final conclusions. Portuguese colonialism, Portuguese Empire did have environmental consequences that happened. Also, Portuguese colonialism did have impacts on indigenous peoples. My problem is how to cross both things. So how to cross I think I don't remember. I think mostly trying to answer Katia. It was a kind of two parallel processes. The process of expropriation of land and other effects or negative effects on the indigenous population, and the other one was the process of impacting the environment. The problem is how these different processes cross. Yeah.
How is so that process that you just described, right, of land expansion, right? How is that not the link? Exactly, that is the link between what you're looking for, the colonialism, the exchanges with the indigenous populations, and the impact on the environment.
Yeah, colonialism impacted both.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right?
Good. Great.
Yeah, but the relationship here is exactly the land, right? The land, because the Europeans, when they move into the land, they're not going to do the same things to the land as the indigenous populations did. So the land is your, you know, that's the smoking gun, I think, that you have in your hand and that you know so well from your studies. That is exactly the catalyst where these three things meet, right? Or you would like to extricate land from the idea of environment. I mean, it's
no. That is not the point. That's not the point.
So perhaps, sorry.
Well, so that is one process. I think it's the kind of conclusion that I said. If we admit that the resistance of native people limited the colonization, and that is true. The colonization moved according to the ability to resist on the part of the native people. But if we admit that the resistance of native people delayed or limited the occupation of land or the occupation of territories, and if the occupation of territories and land means an environmental impact, of course, here we have a relation. But I think this is a kind of relation, a very generalist relation. I'd like to have more concrete aspects, but I'm glad you feel that this is that this kind of big picture is enough. I don't know. So more trying to answer one or two or three more questions about the effects of Portuguese policies in Brazil. I'm not denying at all the impact of colonial policies in the indigenous rights. So that is true, and I take it for granted. But I think we should also look into the other side of this question, because it is true that the indigenous communities were granted lands in the form of cismarias, collective grants for the whole village, but they also were encouraged to cultivate land in a kind of contractual form individually, not to mention that they incorporated progressively the the Brazilian society by miscegenation. So part of the original indigenous people at some point was incorporated in the normal working of that type of society. So that is true also. It was not only, there was not only a violation of rights, of native rights in Brazil. There was also, there was more an idea of incorporation, of protection of those that indigenous people. I think that was the main idea, to incorporate them, and of course to find a way that the indigenous notion of territory, the indigenous connection to land, could not be an obstacle to the occupation of that land by the colonists, by the settlers. And when we think about the individual, not the policies, ground policies, authorities policies, but when we think on the communities of settlers or the individuals, they were quite violent against the indigenous communities to take to seize their lands. So the process of violence, violation, they happened in Brazil with no doubt. I have no doubt about that. I know also that the resistance of the native people conditioned the directions of the colonization. That's why that colonization was not made in a homogeneous way, as José Augusto said, because probably there was more resistance there from the part of the native communities and so on. Regarding Asia, the tombos of Ceylon were a way of registering the lands. They were not at the origin of massive transfer of lands in what concerned the ordinary people.
Oh, yes, I agree with that.
So,
yeah.
as I said in my presentation, the ordinary people was not affected in a generalized way. The native elites, yes. Although those the lands registered in those tombs, land registers, were, and the ones that were redistributed among religious orders, some Portuguese settlers, and most of all distributed to the native elites, were lands previously belonging to the king's share, the native king's share. So yes, they are part of the native society. In that sense, means that there were changes, as I had said, of course. Well, I don't know if I left. Yes, of course, I left behind some questions. But if you want me to clarify something else, no? We are all a bit tired. No?
Thank you so much for the paper and for the work and reflection. So we need to be at Masala Zone at 7 o'clock. English 7 o'clock now, within 40 minutes. I know. So it is